It was just another late night at the office, until her hand brushed my shoulder, and suddenly, everything I thought I knew about her, and myself, changed. It was one of those late evenings at the office when the hum of the fluorescent lights felt louder than usual, and the quiet made every small sound, the tapping of keys, the scrape of a chair, echo a little too clearly. I was hunched over my desk, eyes straining against the glare of the screen, reviewing numbers and reports I had already gone through half a dozen times. The office felt empty, almost abandoned, except for me, and yet there was a strange sense of anticipation I couldn't place. That's when she walked in. My boss. Not just any boss. The kind of woman who carried herself with effortless confidence, a quiet authority that commanded attention without a word. She was in her early 40s, graceful in a way that wasn't showy, but magnetic in its subtlety. Her presence filled the room before she even spoke, and I realized I had been holding my breath. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor as she approached, the rhythm precise, measured. The faint scent of her perfume, warm, slightly floral, drifted to me, unexpected yet oddly comforting. She stopped just behind me, her eyes scanning the spreadsheet I had been obsessing over. "You're not done yet," she said, her voice calm but carrying a quiet weight that made me sit up a little straighter. And then, as if to punctuate the reminder, her hand brushed lightly against my shoulder. It was brief, almost casual, yet I felt a spark, a warmth that traveled down my arm, catching me completely off guard. I shifted slightly, trying not to make it obvious, but the touch lingered in my mind long after she had moved on. It wasn't just the physical contact, it was the steadiness in her fingers, the subtle pressure that seemed both reassuring and gently commanding. For a moment, I became acutely aware of the contrast between her calm confidence and my own racing thoughts. I told myself it was professional, that she was just reminding me to finish the work. But there was something in the way she leaned over the desk just slightly, how her hair fell softly against her shoulder, that made the air between us feel charged, like an unspoken connection had sparked and then gone quiet. As she turned to leave, I caught the faintest smile at the corner of her lips. Not at me exactly, but something meant only for the moment, for me to notice if I were paying attention. My heartbeat didn't slow immediately. I returned to my work, but every number on the screen blurred into insignificance compared to the memory of that single, fleeting touch. That night, I realized this wasn't just another ordinary day. Something had shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet undeniably. It was the beginning of a quiet awareness that she was no longer just my boss. She was a presence that could unsettle and steady me at the same time, a warmth I hadn't expected in the middle of spreadsheets and fluorescent light. And somehow, I knew this late-night office, this ordinary place, was no longer ordinary at all. The days that followed were strangely different. The office, which had once felt familiar and routine, now seemed charged with small, almost imperceptible moments that made my chest tighten in ways I couldn't name. She was still my boss, professional, composed, and undeniably competent. Yet there was a subtle warmth in her presence that seemed to linger longer than necessary. We worked together on projects as usual, but I began noticing the small gestures that went unnoticed by anyone else. When she leaned over my desk to point something out, her hand would hover a fraction too long near mine, brushing the edge of my arm as she adjusted a paper. The sensation was fleeting but electric, the kind of touch that left a quiet echo behind, like a ripple in still water. I found myself aware not just of her actions, but of the warmth of her skin, the soft texture of her blouse against her arm, the faint brush of her hair as it fell forward while she spoke. Sometimes, our eyes would meet in moments too brief to be meaningful to anyone else. But to me, they carried entire sentences, unspoken and unresolved. She would raise an eyebrow in that subtle way she had, the kind that suggested amusement, curiosity, or maybe just patience, and my mind would spiral trying to interpret the meaning. Every glance, every smile, every casual touch seemed to speak a language I was just learning, and the more I noticed, the more I wanted to understand it. It wasn't just the physical presence. Her voice had a new resonance now, softer at unexpected moments, carrying a warmth that made simple instructions feel intimate. When she asked me to double-check a figure or clarify a detail, I caught the subtle tilt of her head, the way she leaned slightly closer, and I felt a strange comfort in it, even as my pulse quickened. And yet, there was hesitation on both sides. I told myself this was all in my head, that she was a professional, and I was her subordinate. But each small touch, each lingering glance, made me wonder if perhaps she felt the same way, even if only subconsciously. The age difference and workplace boundaries loomed silently, making every gesture charged with restraint and longing. One evening, as the office emptied around us, she stayed behind to review some documents. She moved with her usual graceful authority, yet there was a softness to her tonight. When she passed by my desk, our shoulders brushed, a fleeting contact, yet enough to make me aware of her proximity, of the warmth radiating from her body, and the quiet steadiness in her movements. I looked up and caught her gaze, holding it a fraction longer than I should have, feeling that same spark I had felt the first night. By the time I left that evening, my thoughts weren't on the work I had completed. They were on her, on the subtle ways she had touched my life, on the quiet intimacy growing between us in these small, seemingly insignificant moments. I realized that what had begun as a brief, professional encounter was slowly unfolding into something more complicated, something neither of us had yet named, but both of us were beginning to feel. It was on one of those quieter evenings when the office seemed to have shrunk around us, the hum of the fluorescent lights softer than usual, that I noticed something different in her expression. We were reviewing a proposal together, the room scattered with papers and half-empty coffee cups, and for a brief moment, her usual composure slipped. Her shoulders tensed slightly, a small crease appearing between her brows, and I realized she was not as untouchable as she appeared. She leaned over the desk, pointing at a section of the report, and I caught the faintest tremor in her fingers. Instinctively, I reached out, placing my hand briefly on her forearm, professional, reassuring, yet warm enough to convey a quiet steadiness. She looked at me, and for a heartbeat, her guarded eyes softened, just enough for me to glimpse the vulnerability she normally kept hidden. Then, almost shyly, she shared a story about a challenge she had faced years ago, something personal, something that revealed a depth of experience I had only seen hints of before. Her voice was lower than usual, almost hesitant, but layered with strength. I listened, captivated not just by the story, but by the subtle intimacy of the moment, the way she allowed herself to let down her guard in this quiet corner of the office. As she spoke, I became acutely aware of every detail. The way her hair fell across her shoulder as she tilted her head, the warmth of her presence close to mine, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the soft aroma of coffee. I felt a pull toward her, a mixture of admiration, protectiveness, and something deeper, more tender that I couldn't yet define. She paused, looking up at me with an expression that was almost shy but entirely genuine. The usual authority was still there, but it was softened by trust. I realized that this was rare, this level of openness, this willingness to share a part of herself with me. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that she didn't have to carry everything alone, but the words felt too heavy, too early. Instead, I offered a quiet smile, letting her know I was present, that I was listening, that I cared. For a long moment, we stayed like that, side by side over the scattered documents, neither speaking, just existing in the small cocoon of shared vulnerability. Her hand brushed against mine as she adjusted a paper, and I felt the familiar spark, the warmth of contact that carried more meaning than words could convey. I realized then that our connection had deepened beyond the subtle flirtations and fleeting touches of before. Now, it carried something heavier, richer, something built on trust and shared humanity. When she finally returned to her notes and straightened up, the tension eased from her shoulders, replaced by that quiet confidence I had always admired. But now, there was a new layer beneath it, a softness reserved for me, a subtle acknowledgement that we were no longer just boss and employee. Something unspoken was growing between us, tender and fragile, waiting for the right moment to be understood, and I felt both the thrill and the weight of being entrusted with it. It was another late night at the office, the kind where the outside world seemed to vanish behind the darkened windows, and the only sounds were the soft hum of computers and the occasional scrape of a chair. I was still at my desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard, trying to finish a report that refused to feel complete. She appeared behind me, as quietly and deliberately as ever, her presence immediately filling the space around me. She leaned over to review the figures on my screen, and I became acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her shoulder as it brushed mine. Just a fleeting contact, but enough to make the air between us feel suddenly electric. The office seemed to shrink, the fluorescent lights harsh and glaring in contrast to the sudden flutter in my chest. My pulse quickened, though I told myself it was just the stress of work. Our hands accidentally met as we both reached for the same document, and she didn't pull away immediately. The brief touch lingered, a small, innocent contact, yet charged with an intimacy that neither of us spoke aloud. I noticed the curve of her fingers, the gentle firmness in her grip, and the subtle way her wrist brushed against mine. It was a moment of silent communication, a wordless acknowledgement that we were both aware of the tension building in the room. Her eyes met mine, holding my gaze just a fraction longer than professional decorum would normally allow. There was something in her expression, a softening, a subtle curiosity, a quiet challenge, that made my stomach tighten. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the spell, but the words caught in my throat. So I stayed still, letting the moment stretch out, both terrifying and exhilarating. She straightened slightly, moving to point at a figure on the spreadsheet, and her shoulder brushed mine again, almost by accident. Each time, it sent a small ripple through me, warmth, tension, and a strange comfort all mixed together. I was painfully aware of how close she was, of how natural her presence felt, yet of how impossible it seemed to cross any boundary. The age difference, the office hierarchy, the rules of decorum, all of it pressed against my thoughts like a silent warning. For a few seconds, the room felt suspended in time. It was just her and me, the papers, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the quiet electricity of shared awareness. Neither of us spoke, yet every gesture, every touch, every lingering glance carried meaning. The tension wasn't just romantic. It was layered with respect, admiration, and a quiet longing neither of us could voice. Finally, she pulled back slightly, returning to her work with that calm, professional composure that made her so magnetic. I exhaled slowly, though my chest still felt tight. The spark of that, almost, moment lingered, a reminder that the slow burn between us had shifted into something undeniably present. I realized that the office, which had always felt ordinary, had transformed into a space where unspoken desires and subtle intimacies could exist, hidden in plain sight, delicate and intoxicating. The days after that lingering touch felt different, though nothing was explicitly said. The office routine continued, but every glance, every gesture, carried a new weight. It was as if we were speaking in a private language, unspoken, subtle, but unmistakably there. Even the smallest interactions seemed layered with meaning, and I found myself paying attention to details I had never noticed before. One afternoon, she passed by my desk with a stack of files, her fingers brushing the top edge of mine as she handed them over. It was accidental, or so it seemed, but I felt the warmth of her touch linger, a quiet, grounding presence. I looked up at her, and she offered a fleeting smile, brief, almost imperceptible, yet it was enough to make my chest tighten. There was an understanding in that glance, a silent acknowledgement that we both felt the same pull, even if we didn't speak it aloud. Later, we found ourselves alone in a conference room, reviewing the final details of a project. The conversation was professional, but there was an easy comfort now, a playful undertone in the way she spoke. A joke, a teasing remark, a light nudge on my shoulder, gestures that were small but intimate, hinting at emotions neither of us had fully admitted. I noticed the way her eyes softened when she looked at me, the subtle tilt of her head as if listening not just to my words but to the space between them. At one point, she noticed I had been staring at a particularly complicated chart for too long. Without a word, she rested her hand lightly on my arm, just above the elbow. The contact was fleeting, yet it carried reassurance and encouragement, a quiet promise that she believed in me. The warmth of her skin against mine made my thoughts stumble, and I realized that her gestures, professional in intention, yet intimate in effect, were slowly breaking down my defenses. There was also a vulnerability in her actions, a softness she allowed only in these moments. When she shared a story about a challenge she had faced earlier in her career, she leaned slightly closer, and I could feel the subtle steadiness in her presence, the warmth of her proximity. I wanted to tell her that I understood, that I was there for her, but the words felt unnecessary. In this shared space, gestures spoke louder than dialogue ever could. By the time we left the office that evening, the connection between us was undeniable. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was there in the lingering touches, the stolen glances, and the comfort of shared space. I walked to my car with a quiet awareness of her presence, feeling the slow, steady burn of something growing between us, something tender, tentative, and profoundly human. It was a subtle confession, spoken in gestures and glances rather than words, and it left me both exhilarated and anxious for the moments yet to come. It was later than usual, the office almost completely empty, the only light coming from the glow of our computers. I was still at my desk, finishing the last pieces of a report that seemed to demand more time than it deserved. The quiet of the night was almost comforting, yet my thoughts kept returning to her, to the way her presence had grown in my mind over these past days. She approached, moving with her usual calm confidence, yet there was a softness in her tonight, something almost imperceptible but impossible to ignore. When she stopped beside my desk, her shoulder brushed mine again, this time with a gentleness that lingered longer than before. The warmth radiated through me, steady and grounding, and I felt an ache of awareness, a mix of longing, admiration, and cautious hope. "You're not done yet," she said softly, her voice carrying that same calm authority, but now with an undercurrent of something warmer, more personal. The words themselves were simple, practical, about the report, about work, yet the tone, the proximity, and the quiet intensity in her eyes conveyed something entirely different. It was encouragement, yes, but also a subtle acknowledgement of the connection we had been dancing around for days. As she spoke, she rested her hand lightly on my shoulder. The contact was fleeting, yet it sent a shiver of awareness down my spine. It wasn't bold or overt, but the intimacy of the gesture, her warmth, the steady pressure, the quiet steadiness in her touch, spoke volumes. For a moment, the office seemed to shrink around us. The hum of computers and the distant ticking of the clock faded into the background. There was only her presence, solid and gentle, and the unspoken understanding between us. I met her gaze, and in that brief exchange, 1,000 unspoken words passed between us. The tension that had been building over days, the subtle touches, the lingering glances, the quiet conversations, culminated in this one small, charged moment. My chest felt tight, my mind dizzy with the awareness that what we were feeling was real, mutual, and undeniably present, even if unspoken. She pulled back slightly, giving a small, almost imperceptible smile, as if to reassure me, to test the boundaries of our shared understanding. I realized then that we didn't need words to acknowledge what was happening. The moment itself, her shoulder against mine, her voice soft but warm, the quiet electricity in the air, was a confession in code, a declaration of desire without crossing any line. By the time she returned to her desk, the weight of the moment lingered in the air like a soft perfume. I exhaled slowly, my heart still racing, acutely aware that our connection had shifted. The spark we had been nurturing in small gestures and fleeting touches had grown into something tangible, undeniable. In that quiet, electric night, I knew we had crossed an invisible threshold, one that could never be ignored again. The days that followed felt lighter, even in the quiet hum of the office. Nothing was said aloud about that late-night moment. No confessions, no declarations, yet the air between us had subtly changed. Every glance carried unspoken understanding. Every touch, no matter how fleeting, seemed more deliberate, more meaningful. We moved through the routines of work, but there was a shared awareness now, a quiet intimacy that made ordinary tasks feel extraordinary. One afternoon, we found ourselves side by side at the printer. The office was empty except for the two of us. As she adjusted a paper jam, her hand brushed mine, not by accident, but intentionally gentle. The warmth of her fingers against mine sent a familiar flutter through me. I looked up, meeting her eyes, and she gave me a small, knowing smile. There was no rush, no pressure, just the comfort of shared understanding. For a moment, it felt as if the rest of the world had disappeared, leaving only us in a suspended bubble of quiet connection. Later that week, We lingered over coffee in the break room after finishing a particularly demanding project. She laughed softly at something I said, the sound rich and warm, and I realized that I was noticing everything about her. The way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the subtle tilt of her head, the graceful ease in her movements. I caught her gaze holding mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I knew she felt it too. The pull, the unspoken bond, the subtle romantic tension that had been building since those first accidental touches. There were no dramatic gestures, no grand confessions. Instead, our connection settled into something quieter, steadier, a warmth that didn't need words to be understood. When she rested her hand lightly on my arm while reaching for the sugar, or when I offered to carry a stack of files for her, it felt like a conversation in a language only we could speak. Every glance, every brush of skin, every shared laugh reinforced a closeness that was both tender and exhilarating. By the end of the week, I realized something profound. What had started as subtle touches and stolen glances had grown into a bond rooted in respect, trust, and quiet affection. The age difference and the office hierarchy, once looming barriers in my mind, had become a backdrop to a relationship that thrived on patience, understanding, and slow, deliberate intimacy. As I packed up to leave on Friday evening, she approached, standing close but without pressure. Her presence was comforting, familiar, and somehow thrilling all at once. She gave me a soft smile and said, almost casually, "Have a good weekend." I felt a warmth spread through me, not just from her words, but from everything that lay between them, unspoken yet undeniably real. Walking to my car, I realized that our story wasn't about dramatic declarations or impulsive confessions. It was about small moments, touches, glances, shared silences, that had grown into something deeply human and profoundly intimate. The slow-burn connection we had nurtured had reached its natural conclusion, a quiet, tender romance built on trust, mutual respect, and subtle, enduring affection. And for the first time, I felt certain that this connection, however unconventional, was exactly where it was meant to be. If you enjoyed this slow-burn romance and want to see more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what part of this story resonated with you the most.